What next is a man who needs no introduction, but I am going to give him one anyway. The man's name is Kelsey Hightower, and if you go to his Twitter bio says that he's a minimalist. That's the introduction. No, in all seriousness, I am actually going to use someone else's tweet. So this is a fireside chat, and Kelsey's going to be doing a fireside chat with Saron at Codeland 2022 coming up. And Saron had this lovely tweet to say, I can't do any better. So I'll just read it verbatim. Kelsey is one of my favorite people on the internet. He's so knowledgeable, respected, smart, but also super humble and accessible. Anytime we connect, I feel so lucky to be in his presence, but also like he's just an ordinary guy who happens to love tech too. Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you, Kelsey, for joining us and well, being willing to do a second fireside chat with me here at DevOps Days Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm honored to be here. Such a great cause, showing the community stepping up to support all of our community members. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you so much. So the idea for those of you who maybe have never seen a fireside chat before, because there's a first time for everything, is that it isn't a formal presentation. There are no slides. The idea is just that Kelsey and I will have what is hopefully a fluid, dynamic, and interesting discussion. We have already some questions that have been prepared by our community that I'm going to intersperse into this as well. If you have some questions, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as we go along as well. But the idea again is to just see where the conversation takes us and see what kind of insights we can derive through just through a chat. So Kelsey, if you don't mind, I'll just dive right into the first question that happens to be on my list, and that is, when is the right time to solve DevOps or SRE at scale if you are growing a company?
Yeah, I mean, I think, depending on what your interpretation of DevOps and SRE are, if you just, if you put the words to the side for a second and you sit around with a small team, maybe it's 10 of you all, one good benefit you have, typically there's a great shared understanding, right? You know why you work there. You're probably very clear on what your role, company that small, you probably have many roles. And the objective is to do what's necessary to get things done. I think the bigger you get, the larger the company, the more time you're at it, that tends to get diluted over time too, where people just focus only on their job, not necessarily the job to be done for the company or for the customers. So I think as a smaller team, one thing you can learn from these disciplines, right? Because as a company that gets big, you have to be very explicit about what you need people to do in order to work together, especially when they're in different offices, they come from different backgrounds. Some people have joined the company 10 years after its inception, so they may not be aware of what the core mission is. So they need way more guidance and frameworks about what to do and how to collaborate. So I would say this, things like SRE, this discipline around engineering by using actual metrics, using actual science to decide where we should prioritize to meet objectives and goals. It's like simple as that. I think SRE gives us a little bit of practice. Maybe there's some tools to help us understand that we don't need to invent this stuff from scratch. And I think the same is true of DevOps as well. Philosophy-wise, what skills can you bring to the table? And let's not redefine ourselves based on HR job descriptions. We should be able to go beyond that and be willing to collaborate even when it's hard or even when that's not necessarily our job.
Right. Yeah, and that's a lot of interesting insights there. I'll rewind just a little bit. You mentioned a small shop. A lot of people have a lot of different hats, right? So I'm summarizing there. Um, that's the sort of environment where the person who's doing the DevOps is doing the SRE might also be the backend developer, might also happen to be the developer relations person, might also happen to be, right? I imagine that there's, could also maybe even be a pre-optimization issue there, right? Where okay, like trying to focus too much on one thing and letting other balls drop. Uh, that sort of, I think, is obvious on its face. But is that something that could happen even at a more mature organization?
It happens all day at a mature organization. I think the larger organizations, look, the hardest thing to do in any human system, whether we're talking about a sports team, a family, or a group of people who work at the same company trying to deliver on something, who owns what, Can they deliver? And how do we support them in doing that, even though we all have our own lanes to swim in? And so I think divvying up those areas of responsibility, holding ourselves accountable, right? Let's just think about it from simple terms. If you say you can get the front end done in 2 weeks, and now we're on week three, we kind of have a problem, right? Everyone's kind of, waiting for you to do that particular thing. Maybe no one has the skills to actually help you. And so now everyone has this kind of codependency on you getting your part done. And most human systems, there exists this level of dependency. So now the question is, going forward, do I learn some front end skills so I can be there to support you? Maybe we can collaborate on it together. Do I figure out ways of adjusting the overall timeline to account for that particular situation? So I think for us, just the biggest struggle is, as humans, the accountability, dividing the work up in the best way, the most efficient way possible, where we can all play our roles, collaborate together, and then ideally live up to the promises we make. And when we fall short, can the team be there to support us? I think that's what we're all trying to figure out in all of our human structures.
Yeah, definitely. This actually ties in very nicely with our keynote talk today. Patrick was, talking about sort of humans and how they're structured together and into groups and teams and whatnot. One of the things he mentioned was at some point we're all going to be interdependent on each other, right? So, he mentioned that one of the challenges is not so much how do you determine if a team is being productive, if a team is accomplishing its goals, but how is that team working with other teams? Are those relationships productive? Are those relationships, achieving their goals? Right. I like to think that in the world of management today, at least we have a pretty good way of thinking about, like, talking about OKRs and talking about being goal oriented and whatnot. We kind of have a good feel for for whether a team or a team member is being productive. But do you have any insight into thinking about measuring how teams are being productive and working with each other in particular?
Yeah, I would say we don't actually have a lot of great experience in management. A lot of our industry so far is copy and paste, right? Oh, this company uses OKRs, we're going to use OKRs. I heard about DevOps, we're going to do DevOps. And people have no context about what this is. Remember, team building is a very unique skill. You have to constantly know the capabilities of your team members at an individual level and then be constantly optimizing for those individuals. And when you think about the interfaces between different teams, the interfaces need to be very clear. And that is not necessarily the case in most enterprise structures, right? Most things that we're building aren't deliberate, right? We bought Oracle because someone chose Oracle 10 years before we got there. We chose Java because that was the best programming language for the person who started the company. And now we're just using Java to write everything because it's too hard to bring in another language. These things aren't very explicit. So when we start to interface with each other, it's equally as ambiguous about what we actually are doing, right? Because I think when you think about great team design, you literally have to have clean contracts between them all. Like some people say silos are bad. Are they really? I'll take a silo with an API any day of the week. If your team can produce an SLA, an API that I can depend on, I'd rather talk to you over lunch about other things happening in the world than like how to do another deployment for the thousandth time in 2 years. So I think we got to just make sure we understand what team building is all about. And I just honestly believe not everyone understands the nuance that comes into working with individuals and defining the contract between the groups.
Excellent. You're talking about contracts, talking about the idea of SLA, SLO, SLI, the triplet there. If I may be so bold, venturing into the world of promise theory, venturing into the world of trying to guarantee these relationships, codify them, if you will, on the team. And that sort of is a vague segue into one of the next questions, actually. So we talked about how we're interacting and measuring how we interact with our teams, but it's also, of course, to measure how we interact with our customers, with the people who are ultimately consuming what it is that we're building, selling, whatever verb there, right? You have done and continue to do a lot of work around customer empathy, this idea of empathy, of being empathetic. Uh, can you just kind of give us a high level overview of some of your more important learnings? Did it change your view of distributed systems and how they should be? And then, of course, does it change your view of distributed teams and how they should be built?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to like customer empathy, like the person that's really paying for the thing your company as a whole is selling in the marketplace, right? That's the end game. And so, as an individual, think about how we start the process. We say, hey, join our company. You can be a DevOps engineer level 3, right? That's how it starts. So you come in, it's like, yeah, I can do the DevOps. Where's the DevOps? Let's do DevOps. So you come in and you understand this narrow part of the equation and you kind of just do your thing. The truth is, in our industry, you can get real far without ever using the product or meeting any of your customers ever. And you probably can do just fine writing Terraform and deploying stuff all day, right? And you probably even get promoted with that. The problem with that, though, is you can't actually engage higher level into the whole organizational structure. If someone says, how should we pivot the business? You will have no idea or clue. Number one, because you don't use the product. Number two, you have no awareness of the market conditions that in which you operate. And so a lot of times I think people have regulated themselves into these boxes with these labels that they don't understand the full mission. Why are you here? What role do you serve in the whole? And all of the pieces are important if you want to put together the full puzzle, right? Any piece missing, then you won't have the complete picture. So I think a lot of times as technologists, and I've been guilty of this before in my career, where we assume engineering is the most important function of any business, right? We believe it's the hardest task. We believe that it's the thing that requires the smartest people. And so sometimes we get into this world of, as long as technology has this bubble, we will power the business. We will transform the business. Like, no, you won't. The business will have goals and you can support those goals through technology. That's the way it works. That's the relationship. So it behooves you to understand the customer, the business, and of course the technology that powers those two things. But when we get the order wrong, then I think this is where we start to become myopic and miss the big picture.
Absolutely. That is, I think, sound advice for anybody coming into a technological career at any level, right? You could be doing your first, what's it called in English, a stage, internship, or somebody who's already decades into their career and looking to sort of advance further is sit down with the salespeople, sit down with the product people, sit down with the stakeholders, embed with the support team, right? Get yourself onto a client call, really just expand your horizon, right?
Yeah, use the product. Like literally, like be a customer for a day. Ask yourself, would I pay for this? I get it that not everything we work on is designed for the average person to use, but just getting in that context the best you can, I think will give you that necessary empathy to think about the way you write tests, the way you write documentation, the way you present that product, the way you support your support team who has to interface directly with the customer base. And I think just having that little bit of empathy will really go a long way.
You suggest would be a path to getting into those conversations, to putting oneself in those situations. Some employers would be more than happy to, if one of the engineers goes, hey, I'd like to just be more involved on a sales call or hang out with the support people, whatever. And they'd be like, yeah, go do it. And they're definitely going to be organizations which would be reticent to that. Like, why? Why are you getting out of your swim lane? That's not, don't do that. What would be advice for the people in that second scenario?
Yeah, so let's think about, let's say you work at a company that makes tractors, like tractors, right? You'd be like, well, I don't have any farmland. There's no reason for me to use a tractor. Like that is a specialized device. But maybe the company wants to now have like predictive maintenance. So they put a bit of technology on that tractor. So now you're brought in because now all of these tractors have sensors. They're sending data to a centralized place. They're doing some analysis. They're running models locally to decide whether there should be some maintenance performed on this tractor or not to preserve the life of that purchase. So you come in and you may do all the DevOps things. You may be some center of excellence transforming, but then you ask yourself, it's like, well, who is the customer? How do they want to get information about should the tractor be fixed? What happens if you fix the tractor prematurely during harvest season? What happens if you were to optimize for more of an off season so that the tractor isn't out of commission as early? Would you tune your models for that? If your model is tuned too much based on like heat and temperature, but that's when tractors are typically used to harvest things before the winter comes. So maybe you can go out to where they build these things. Maybe you can go to the testing site. Hell, drive one. Look at the sensors. Drive one that's about to go into maintenance and ask yourself, is it easy to tell that this thing is going to maintenance? Ask a previous owner before you had this capability, how did they know it needed to be fixed? How long is an acceptable cycle to be fixed? So just getting some time, either as a temporary customer yourself, or literally engaging with people who have been a customer and just asking them questions. So go visit them. Hey, can I check out where do you store this thing? What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? And that just gives you a little bit of context to say, hey, I'm building this person for this person. This is how they use it. And that will, I think, give you the ability to form. So you can do this for any industry. Just go be a customer for a day, right? Get with your sales team and say, hey, who's our biggest customer? Who's our smallest customer? Who's a customer that refuses to be our customer because they don't like our product? What deals have we lost? Can I go visit them to see what the competition is doing and what we could do better? I think that's just a cheat code if you want to accelerate your ability to build stuff for actual customers.
Nice. Thank you for that. So we're going to switch gears here, so to speak, talking about tractors. We're going to switch gears here for a moment and get into another little question stream here. It's about learning new things, right? So you're someone who is known for taking on passion projects and learning new things, and that's laudable. What inspires you to keep learning, and do you have any tips on how to learn? And I know that sounds sort of silly, right? But what are your techniques for learning, for engaging yourself and keeping yourself engaged in new things?
I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people on this call that these skills were a method of survival. A lot of people don't come from money. A lot of people didn't see a future where they go to college, graduate, and just get, a standard corporate job. So from a lot of us that come from these kind of self-taught paths, what were our options? When I was starting out, it was like fast food forever. That was in my mindset. And so just understanding that there was an entry point for self-taught people that you can go pay for IT certification, and then you can get into this world where it seems professional. People seem to be making good money. There's benefits, there's all these things. So for a lot of us, we treated this as a method of survival. So learning these skills, you took super serious. This is like breathing or drinking water. And so when someone says, and at least in my 20-year career, every time I learned some new skills, it equated to more income and more opportunities. So anytime there's a feedback loop that is that instrumental to like your life, you start to internalize this. I'm a craftsman. This is my trade. And so in order to be someone that people want to have work on their team, to be attractive in this job market, I've always seen the need to kind of acquire certain skills to make that stand out. Now, it's very different, right? I've had a lot of success in my career. I've been able to kind of get to some level of financial stability. So then the question is different. It's not necessarily a tool of survival, but I've noticed is that once you learn the fundamentals, it isn't so hard to learn the new stuff, right? In our industry, we always think, oh, service mesh is new. Cloud native is new. But trust me, the fundamentals are roughly the same as before. So if you took it serious before, when the new thing shows up and you've grasped the fundamentals, you can kind of pierce through the marketing, you can pierce through the hype. And what you'll find is that the fundamentals may have a new workflow, a new way of configuring, maybe a slightly improvement on the old methods to implement the same ideas. And so for me, I've always found joy in like being able to take a new thing, apply the fundamentals, and just see where I am, right? Just say, hey, am I still on top of my game? And if I'm not, if the answer is no, then I see that as an opportunity to continue to invest in myself and giving myself access to even more opportunities going forward. So that's the way I look at it.
No, that definitely, as a fellow autodidact, I grew up in projects and and whatnot too. That definitely resonates with me. This idea that it wasn't just like, oh, I'll just go to university and I'll get a degree and me and all my Stanford buddies will go do Stanford buddy things, right? Right? Like as you said, not everybody's got that same path. And thinking about it, uh, I like what you said about the feedback loop, right? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be a life or death feedback loop, although certainly it can be. But this idea of finding opportunities to have feedback loops, right? Where you can go, I have done a thing, and this is the result of the thing I have done. Um, I imagine that could be something fairly lofty, like I have got a new certification and now I get a 15% bump on my salary. Like, obviously, that's a really cool feedback loop. But are there any smaller scale feedback loops that you can offer? Things that people could sort of implement and might not have to dedicate their lives to getting that loop going.
I would say confidence. A lot of success is just people attempting. Just making an attempt is the first step to success. And so when you learn a new skill, you gain this level of confidence that you can do it, right? If you complete that iOS tutorial, that's the first step at building an iOS game and maybe building a company around that. And so for a lot of us, just learning the program, I remember when I learned how to make a for loop for the first time, right? You stare at the page and you're like, how is this even working, right? This syntax looks weird. This is not like anything I've ever seen before. And then at some point it clicks in your brain what's happening and your confidence level goes up. So I'm like, well, okay, if I can do this in Bash, I now have the confidence to try it in Python. If I can do it in Python, now I have the confidence to try it in Ruby. And so then you start to just take away those kind of artificial limitations you put on yourself because you know that, okay, I am capable. I do have the ability to understand this stuff. So I would say that is the best feedback loop because it's internal. You feel it. I don't know about you all, but I get overflushed with emotions. Like you just want to do that little dance. Like, I can't believe I know how to do this. Oh my God, let me go do something.
Now that's cool. Keeping that wonder, keeping that delight, right? I think that's something that's overlooked, and certainly in some social media nerd spaces, right? This idea that we all have to be super serious all the time, and and that you have to get good or get done. But I like that perspective that it's okay to have fun and it's okay to be happy and be proud of what you're learning, right? Even if it's just your first day, even if it's your first minute. That's a good and powerful message. So thank you for sharing that. So again, we got tons of questions. We got people on the chat. This is the sort of thing, where I feel like we could just keep going for hours and hours when we don't have hours. So I will just pick another one here from the question list. We're going to talk a little bit about basically news cycles, getting burnt out on news cycles. I know in the world of tech, a new framework pops up and it's all anybody can talk about for exactly 4.5 minutes, and then it's gone forever, right? And in the real world, we go through these news cycles as well, and people kind of get burnt out on these news cycles. They get burnt out on, frameworks. They get burnt out on languages. And if you're trying to keep people engaged in your project, you're trying to keep people engaged in your topic, you're trying to keep people engaged in your thing, or you yourself are trying to stay engaged in a thing, but you feel like you're getting bombarded and there's just too much of it and you have to turn it off. Do you have any tips on, one, how to keep folks engaged without sort of overwhelming them? And two, how do you keep yourself engaged without basically overwhelming yourself?
You got to remember there's billions of people in the world. And so I think a lot of times we forget that everyone's going to engage at a different time. You know what I mean? It doesn't always have to be in real time. So I think just creating content, creating things that people can discover at the time that's appropriate for them, that's the key. So we just try to produce the best thing we can. So I think to me, my secret has just been authenticity. People don't want you just to regurgitate facts at them. They want to know you as a fellow human being with your own unique perspective. I think sometimes we over focus on just being right, but sometimes people just want your perspective. Maybe you say, look, I know everyone's doing microservices, but that isn't working for me. Here's what I'm doing instead. Because most people, well, if you're like me, you're going to take input from multiple sources. I might watch a video, listen to a podcast, see something on social media, and then I might sleep on it and then to go talk to someone else. So I think for a lot of us, we like to have lots of inputs to inform our opinion versus follow blindly. So I think the best thing we can all do is contribute the best we can, as authentic as we can, and don't shy away from the very unique perspective that makes us unique as individuals. And then in terms of discoverability, I mean, look, it's hard because the people will decide what's popular. People will decide to share a thought or a piece of content with someone else. So I think step one, put the best thing out that you can. Understand, yes, you are competing for everyone's attention, but I say this, once you get their attention, make sure they're happy that they gave it to you, and I think you'll be fine.
That's sage advice. Sage advice. So we had more questions coming in on the Q&A. We talked a lot about communication. Really, that's something we've been dancing around this entire chat so far. Really, is communication, and a lot of our current world of technology that we live in, a lot of way we think about communication, is that it's either synchronous, it's high speed and it's synchronous, right? But that's really not always the case, and so a lot of teams now, especially after the past couple of years, are moving into a more asynchronous world, right, where we can work asynchronously, we can work sort of in different time zones, we can transmit messages at different rates. But the assumption there remains that it's relatively low latency, right? It can be asynchronous, but it doesn't take a lot of time for these messages to be transmitted, and people can consume them at different rates. Thinking then into the future, and it could be now, it could be down the road, is there something maybe that we need to start thinking about long periods of time when we talk about asynchronous communications, but sometimes that might be, if not hours, days, weeks, just like in the olden days when mail had to be transported by ship, right? As we move to the stars, if we want to think in a more grand way, or simply as, times here on Earth when messages and communication are not transmitted at the speeds that we expect. Do you have any ideas on ways that we can think about communication and encouraging us to continue to work together and continue to be productive together, even if there might be long gaps in between our opportunities to transmit?
Yeah, I think this is where you get into this thing that I think we all forget. Like this, we always think about this superhero power like telekinesis, like you can transfer your thoughts to someone else. Oh, that's a fictitious thing. But the truth is, if you think about how language and the written word works, you literally can ship ideas from now to 200 years in the future. Someone 200 years from now can actually pick up something and read it and be inspired or have a guideline on what to do next. And so when we think about our communication, a lot of people want to understand, why are the things the way they are right now? Right? So when the telescope was invented, why did you invent it? What were you doing before? And now that you've invented it, what can you do now? So the next set of people that are wanting to do something above and beyond that, they tend to need a starting point. So what we don't want to do is have everyone starting over. So it's not just enough to leave the telescope behind. We have to leave behind why we arrived to the conclusion that a telescope was needed. So that context matters a lot. So as technologists, when we think about writing a piece of documentation, yeah, you can write documentation like how to get started, copy and paste, do exactly this. That's one way of doing it. Or you can leave guidelines for the future. Here was the environmental conditions that lay groundwork to this idea. Here's that idea manifest in its current form, and here's what I was yet able to build because the technology wasn't supportive, but I'm not going to hide the ideas even though I can't. And I think we ended up getting the CPU from that, right? I think there was someone who thought of the CPU many decades before that was even something we could achieve. So it's so important that you know that sometimes you're actually communicating with the future. So don't forget the context.
And then never so more important as good codes and comments, or good comments and code rather, right? You're effectively communicating with the future, even if the future is just yourself again. And I like what you said about the context. That's super critical, right? Uh, it's one thing to invent a thing, right? And it could be an item of code because we're sitting here talking about computers at DevOps days. It could also be a physical object, right? You invoke the idea of a telescope. It could be something relatively straightforward. Somebody had to figure out the lever, right? Well, what were they doing before the lever? Now, what can we do after the lever, right? Uh, I, when you think about then documenting, right? And you said the written word is of course one way to do it. It's an excellent way to do it. Uh, I have some concerns there, though, right? I mean, language evolves over time. How we choose to store that medium may not be viable over time. Books, despite the fact that a lot of people have moved now to Kindles or audiobooks and so forth, I can go to the library here and literally ask to see a book that was written hundreds of years ago. I don't need a battery. I don't, I don't need something to translate an ancient protocol. I may need to figure out a weird version of French to do it, but I can still read it, right? Is that something maybe that we should be more concerned about? Is okay, great. Like I've committed something to GitHub, but is that going to mean anything 50, 100, 200 years from now?
Yeah, I think Rob Pike wrote about this a while ago, and he talked about like all these digital photos that people are taking, and there is no physical backups of these things. Those camera phones will be lost, those storage mediums will be lost, and all of those pictures will be lost, ideally forever. There's nothing more pleasing, I think, that he wrote about was like finding a shoebox full of pictures that you can physically kind of navigate through. And so when we think about like discovery, right, we're generating all of this content, but it's not really curated nor discoverable. So we do kind of rely on things like search engines, but you can't search for something you don't know exists. It's a really hard thing to do. You might get lucky, but it's really hard. So I think what we have to do is really think about curating things. There's another point I want to make about this whole context thing. When I think about DevOps and all of these transformation projects that all these companies are on, the one thing I notice a pattern, people will join a company and say, why are you doing it this way? Right? This isn't the right CI/CD system. This is not the right programming language. And it's always because we lack the context. Maybe the people who made that decision aren't working there anymore. And you're just like, this is just some legacy thing that needs to be replaced. And so then you go on this mission to replace it, and it's not clear why you're going to do that and what challenges were surrounding the initial decision. So I think one thing that can be very healthy is like everything we do, it's probably important to say, here's the why behind it. Here's what was true at that given time. So when the next person joins and says, hey, this is a dumb idea. Why did anyone pick or do it this way? It would be nice to kind of give them a document to say, here's what was going on at that particular time, right? We had to get it done quick. We had a person that only knew this. We had to do what we had to do. And this is a result of that. And if things were to change in the future, here are the things that you need to consider as we had to consider then. And if those things change, then at least you have this context in which to move forward. So I think that just gives us a lot more context on the decisions we make.
Yeah, I like that. If we look at a piece of code, for example, and as long as it's not gnarly, one should be able to interpret more or less what it's doing, right? Be like, oh, this is the variable and this is the function, and okay, this is the output. Like, fine. But like, why did that code get written? What was the problem it was attempting to solve? What is the value it was attempting to generate? Right? I think that's something we could probably all stand to do a little bit more of in our professional lives as well as our hobby projects. All right. Well, last question before I let you go. Um, and there's so many here in the Q&A, so I'm going to try to pick one last one here. How do you balance learning and growing with the day-to-day requirements of your job? Should there be a component of your job that is specific to learning and growth? Like, should you have, what do you call it, 20% time, or time set aside for hack projects and things like this? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so this is such a complex one because I get it. I've been in this game for 20 years, and a big part of my career, you don't control your time. For some people just starting out, they may not have the ability to advocate for themselves. They may not even know what that means. They may feel like whatever your manager tells you, you got to just do that. And if that takes the whole day, then it takes the whole day. And then at some point, you kind of get to a point where you realize that you have to try to take a little bit more control. And that may mean pushing back a little bit. It may mean learning how to advocate for yourself. But I am clear that, not everyone gets to do that. So what I do is I have things like on my calendar, like work and lunch and learning, right? I'm learning SQLite all over again because it seems to have made a renaissance and it's coming back. And in order
Big
to
time.
do that, I got to block out time. So I'm very explicit about I'm learning right now and I need to learn in order to be able to impact things going forward. And then over time, as I've chosen where to work, not everyone has that luxury either. But as you look for your next job, maybe you say, hey, I need something or a place that either A, aligns with what I'm learning at the moment, or understands that I need to continue learning to increase my value. And that's a conversation you can have. I know it sounds like a weird thing to say, but it isn't obvious to a lot of places that learning is something that needs to be accounted for. And the last thing I'll say here, in the nature of the reality of the world, maybe your job just doesn't care. Unfortunately, maybe your manager just doesn't care. I still believe at the end of the day, you're a craftsman and your job is to make sure you find time to get better at your craft. And I get it, it's not fair. It shouldn't be this way. But that time at home, that might be your time to get better so you can actually choose where you go work next. So I think it's still at the end of the day, ultimately, my responsibility to find time to level up and get those skills. Bonus points if the job agrees.
Excellent. Well, on that note, thank you so much, as always, for taking the time out. It's a pleasure to speak with you. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. I hope to speak with you again in the future. Hope to cross paths again in the future. Thank you again so much, Kelsey, for taking the time out to share a little bit of your wisdom, your experiences, and your thoughts with the community with us here today. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.